The transport shuttle broke through the atmospheric shield of the Galactic Stellar Academy, and Kang Day pressed his face against the window to see the massive station for the first time. It looked like a giant crystal flower floating in space with each petal a different color, representing the various species that studied there. He had dreamed of this moment for years, but now that it was here, his stomach felt tight with nervousness. On his shoulder, a small lizard with emerald green scales shifted her position and flicked her forked tongue. Her amber eyes seemed to watch the station with the same curiosity Day felt. He reached up and gently stroked her head with one finger. "We made it, Nari," he whispered, "just like I promised." The lizard made a soft chirping sound that might have been agreement. The other passengers on the shuttle were already gathering their belongings. Day could see at least 5 different species in the small cabin. There were 2 Velthari with their tall, thin bodies that seemed to be made of living crystal. 3 Orthani sat together, their ancient faces showing the wisdom of a species that had been traveling the stars for millions of years. A pair of Mecrons checked their cybernetic implants, lights blinking under their skin. None of them had spoken to Day during the 3-hour journey from the transport hub. He told himself it was just because everyone was nervous about starting at the academy. It had nothing to do with him being human, but he knew better. The shuttle docked with a gentle thump and the doors slid open. Day grabbed his single bag and followed the other students into the arrival hall. The space was enormous, with a ceiling that seemed to stretch up forever. Hundreds of students from dozens of species moved through the hall, talking in languages Day could barely recognize. His translation implant worked hard to keep up, feeding words directly into his brain. "Attention, new arrivals," a voice said in perfect galactic common. "Please proceed to the registration desks according to your species category. Alpha species to the left, beta species to the center, gamma species to the right." Day felt his face grow hot. Humanity was classified as a beta species, which meant developing but unremarkable. He joined the line at the center desk, trying to ignore the looks he was getting from the other students. A Velthari student standing nearby noticed Nari on Day's shoulder. The crystalline being leaned closer to his companion and spoke in a voice loud enough for Day to hear. "Look, the human brought his pet." "How primitive," his friend laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "Maybe he doesn't understand the difference between a research institution and a petting zoo." Day felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his eyes forward. He had expected this. Humans were still new to the galactic community. Barely 2 generations since first contact. Most species saw them as children playing at being civilized. Nari, however, turned her small head to stare at the Velthari with her unblinking amber eyes. The student stopped laughing and looked away uncomfortably. Next, the registration officer called. She was a Micron with silver skin and glowing blue circuits running down her arms. She looked at Day with professional disinterest. "Name and species." "Kang Day, human. Here for the xenobiology program." The officer scanned his credentials and nodded. "Your quarters are in Section 7, Room 412. Your schedule has been uploaded to your personal device. Classes begin tomorrow at 800 station time." She paused, looking at Nari. "Pets are not allowed in academic buildings." "She's not a pet," Day said quietly. "She's my research companion. I submitted the proper paperwork months ago." The officer scrolled through her screen and frowned. "I see the paperwork, but there's a note here from the xenobiology department head. Professor Thalen wants to speak with you before approving your companion." She said the last word with obvious doubt. "Where can I find Professor Thalen?" "Department office, level 15. But I'd suggest settling into your quarters first." The officer waved him away and called for the next student. Day found his room after getting lost twice in the massive station. Section 7 was clearly not the best area. The corridors were older, the lighting dimmer, and the air recyclers made a constant humming sound. His room was small, barely large enough for a bed, a desk, and a tiny bathroom. But it had a window that looked out at the stars, and that was enough. He set Nari down on the desk and unpacked his few belongings. The lizard watched him work, occasionally tilting her head as if commenting on his choices. "I know what you're thinking," Day said as he arranged his books. "You think I should have fought harder at registration, made them respect us from the start." He sat on the bed and looked at his companion. "But that's not how this works. We have to prove ourselves first." Nari made a trilling sound that Day had learned meant disagreement. "I know you could prove yourself in about 3 seconds, he admitted, "but we talked about this. The whole point of coming here was to do things the right way, to show them that humanity can be part of the galactic community without tricks or shortcuts. The lizard seemed to consider this, then curled up on the desk and closed her eyes. Day smiled. Get some rest. I'm going to find Professor Thalen. The xenobiology department was in one of the nicest parts of the station. The corridors here were wide and clean, with living plants growing in wall gardens. The air smelled like flowers. Students walked past in small groups discussing their research in excited voices. None of them looked at Day except to glance at his empty shoulder and frown. Professor Thalen's office was at the end of a long hallway. The door was open, and Day could see a massive Orthani sitting behind a desk that seemed too small for his large frame. The professor had gray skin that looked like stone, and eyes that had witnessed thousands of years of galactic history. Day knocked on the doorframe. Professor Thalen? I'm Kang Day. The registration office said you wanted to see me. The professor looked up from his work and studied Day for a long moment. Ah yes, the human with the pet lizard. Come in, Mr. Kang, or is it Mr. Day? I can never remember how human names work. Kang is my family name. You can call me Day. He stepped into the office but remained standing. Sit. Thalen gestured to a chair. I read your application with great interest. Your credentials are impressive for such a young species. Top of your class at the Earth Xenobiology Institute. Several published papers on cross-species communication. Very promising. Thank you, Professor. However, Thalen continued, his voice growing stern, I have concerns about this creature you wish to bring to classes. You call it a research companion, but your paperwork describes it as a Terran reptile of no particular intelligence. That sounds like a pet to me. Nari is more than she appears, Dee said carefully. I've been working with her for 3 years. She's helped me with several research projects. Helped how? By sitting quietly while you work? Thalen shook his massive head. Mr. Day, this is the Galactic Stellar Academy. We maintain certain standards. I cannot allow you to bring a simple animal into advanced xenobiology courses simply because you are emotionally attached to it. Day felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. With respect, Professor, you're making assumptions about Nari without ever meeting her. Isn't that the opposite of what a xenobiologist should do? Thalen's eyes narrowed. Are you lecturing me, human? I was studying alien species before your world had invented the wheel. Then you should understand that not everything is what it seems at first glance, Day replied. Give me a chance to prove that Nari belongs here 1 week. If she causes any problems or disrupts any classes, I'll leave her in my quarters. The professor was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. 1 week. But understand this, Mr. Day. You are representing not just yourself, but your entire species here. Every mistake you make reflects on humanity. Every embarrassment is a mark against your world's application for alpha species status. Is your attachment to this creature worth that risk? Day met the ancient alien's eyes without flinching. Nari isn't a risk, Professor. She's the reason I'm qualified to be here at all. You'll see. He left the office before Thalen could respond, his heart pounding. Behind him, he heard the professor mutter something in an ancient language. His translation implant caught only part of it. Foolish young species. They think loyalty to lesser beings makes them noble. Day smiled grimly as he walked back to his quarters. Professor Thalen had no idea how right he was. Loyalty did make you noble, and Nari was far from a lesser being. They just didn't know it yet. The first 3 weeks at the Galactic Stellar Academy were harder than Day had imagined. He had expected some difficulty, some cultural differences to overcome. What he got instead was a wall of contempt that seemed designed to break his spirit. His first class was Introduction to Xenobiology Theory, taught by Professor Thalen himself. Day arrived early with Nari on his shoulder, hoping to make a good impression. The lecture hall was a massive circular room with seats arranged in rising tiers around a central platform. Day chose a seat in the middle section, not too forward but not hiding in the back. As the other students filed in, he noticed the empty seats spreading around him like a disease. No one wanted to sit near the human and his pet. Even species that had no particular reputation for arrogance found reasons to sit elsewhere. A young woman with black hair and sharp features entered the room and paused when she saw Day. She was human, and for a moment Day felt relief. Finally, someone from home. But the look she gave him was not friendly. She walked up to his row and stopped. You're Kang Day? Yes, and you are? Byun Hana. She glanced at Nari with obvious disapproval. I'm in the Advanced Cybernetic Integration Program, sponsored by the Mechron Science Council. I heard about you and your lizard. She said the last word with disgust. Her name is Nari, Day said quietly. I don't care what you call it. Do you have any idea how hard humanity has worked to be taken seriously here? We're barely tolerated as it is. And now you show up with a pet like we're some primitive species that can't tell the difference between research and playtime. Day felt his face grow hot. You don't understand. No, you don't understand, Hana interrupted. Every time you embarrass yourself, you embarrass all of us. Every human who comes after you will be judged by your actions. And right now you're making us all look like fools. She turned and walked to the opposite side of the lecture hall, deliberately sitting as far from Day as possible. Nari made a low hissing sound and Day stroked her scales gently. It's okay, he whispered. She doesn't know. Talking to your pet, human? A voice said from behind him. Day turned to see a Velthari student sitting 2 rows back. His crystalline body sparkled in the lecture hall lights. How very primitive. Does it talk back? Several students laughed. Day turned back to the front and said nothing. Professor Thalen began the lecture by discussing the fundamental principles of xenobiology. It was fascinating material, and Day took detailed notes. He noticed that Nari seemed to watch the professor intently, her amber eyes following every gesture. When the lecture ended, Thalen announced the first assignment. You will work in pairs to analyze the biological structure of an assigned species and present your findings next week. I've already assigned the partnerships based on complementary skills. He began reading the pairs. Velthari students were matched with Orthani. Mechrons were paired with other technological species. When he reached Day's name, there was a long pause. Kang Day will work independently. Professor, Day said, raising his hand. The assignment requires a partner. Then you may present half the required material, or work twice as hard. Thalen's tone made it clear the discussion was over. More laughter echoed through the lecture hall. Day gathered his things and left, Nari silent on his shoulder. The pattern repeated in his other classes. Group projects that excluded him. Lab space that was always assigned last, leaving him with the worst equipment. Research proposals that were rejected without explanation. And always the mockery. Look, the human's pet is sleeping during the lecture. Maybe it died. Can anyone tell the difference? I heard humans are so lonely they need to carry animals everywhere. Sad, really. Day endured it all. He completed his assignments alone, working late into the night in his small quarters. He maintained perfect marks despite the obstacles. And he never responded to the insults, but Nari noticed everything. The lizard became more alert, more watchful. Sometimes Day would wake in the middle of the night to find her sitting on his desk, her amber eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. He wondered what she was thinking, what she was feeling. I'm sorry, he told her one night after a particularly bad day. A group of Velthari students had used their telepathic abilities to move his research materials around the lab while he was working, making him look clumsy and disorganized. I know this isn't what you signed up for. Nari chirped softly and climbed onto his chest, curling into a warm ball. Dave felt some of his frustration fade. At least he wasn't completely alone. The breaking point came during the 4th week. Professor Thalen announced a special assembly for all xenobiology students. The topic was Companion Species Intelligence, a lecture about the various ways different species formed bonds with other life forms. Day hoped this might be his chance to show Nari's value, but Thalen crushed that hope immediately. Due to concerns about disruptions, all companion animals must remain in quarters during this assembly. This includes you, Mr. Kang. Day wanted to argue but saw the satisfaction on Thalen's face. The professor wanted him to make a scene, so instead, Day simply nodded and returned Nari to his room before heading to the assembly hall. The hall was packed with students from every xenobiology class. Day found a seat in the back corner and tried to pay attention to the lecture. Professor Thalen discussed the bonds between Orthani shepherds and their starwing flocks, the symbiotic relationships between Mechron engineers and their nanoswarms, the psychic connections between Velthari and their crystal gardens. Then a student raised his hand. It was the same Velthari who had mocked Day on the first day. His name was Corvin, and he was known as one of the most talented telepaths in his class. Professor, you haven't mentioned the human's pet lizard. Surely that qualifies as a companion species bond. The hall erupted in laughter. Even Thalen smiled slightly. An excellent point, Mr. Corvin. Though I would argue that a simple pet does not rise to the level of the examples we've discussed. True companion species demonstrate measurable intelligence and meaningful interaction with their partners. Then perhaps we should measure it, Corvin suggested. His crystalline face gleamed with malicious amusement. I could perform a basic telepathic scan to establish the creature's cognitive baseline. With your permission, of course, Professor. Day started to stand to object, but Thalen spoke first. An interesting educational opportunity. Mr. Kang, please retrieve your companion. Day's blood ran cold. A telepathic scan of Nari would be invasive and potentially dangerous, but if he refused, it would look like he was hiding something. Or worse, that he knew Nari was actually just a simple animal and didn't want to be exposed. He had no choice. He walked back to his quarters in a daze. Nari was curled on his desk, apparently sleeping. When he entered, her eyes opened immediately. They want to scan you, Day said quietly. Telepathically. I'm so sorry, Nari. I can refuse. We can leave the academy right now, but... The lizard stood and climbed onto his shoulder. She made a soft trilling sound that seemed almost like reassurance. Are you sure? Day asked. Once they scan you, everything changes. There's no going back. Nari touched her small snout to his cheek, a gesture they'd developed over years together. It meant trust. Day carried her back to the assembly hall. The room fell silent as he entered with Nari on his shoulder. He walked down the center aisle to the platform where Professor Thalen and Corvin waited. Place your pet on the examination table, Thalen instructed, gesturing to a small platform. Day gently set Nari down. She sat calmly, her tail wrapped around her body, looking for all the world like a simple lizard with no understanding of what was about to happen. Corvin stepped forward, his hands beginning to glow with soft blue light. 2 other Velthari students joined him, forming a telepathic link to amplify the scan. This will only take a moment, Corvin said, his voice dripping with false kindness. Your pet won't feel a thing. The 3 Velthari placed their glowing hands near Nari's head, and their eyes went blank as they entered deep telepathic focus. The entire assembly hall watched in silence. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. The Velthari students' expressions began to change. Confusion flickered across their crystalline features. Then something else. Something that looked almost like fear. Corvin's eyes suddenly snapped back into focus. He jerked his hands away from Nari as if burned. The other 2 Velthari broke contact as well, stumbling backward. Well? Professor Thalen asked. What is your assessment? Corvin stared at Nari with wide eyes. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by something Day had never seen in a Velthari before. Uncertainty. Maybe even terror. I don't... Corvin stammered. He looked at the other Velthari, who seemed equally shaken. This creature has the cognitive complexity of a Terran house cat. He said the words, but they came out wrong. Forced. Like he was reading from a script he didn't believe. How embarrassing for humanity. Corvin continued in that same hollow voice, to bring such a simple animal to a prestigious academy. But his hands were shaking, and when his eyes met Day's, there was a question in them. A desperate, terrified question that Corvin clearly didn't know how to ask. Day picked up Nari and walked out of the assembly hall. Behind him, he heard Professor Thalen dismiss the confused whispers and continue the lecture as if nothing strange had happened. But something had happened. Corvin had seen something in Nari's mind that had frightened him badly. And rather than tell the truth, he had lied. Day held Nari close as he walked back to his quarters. Students moved out of his way in the corridors, the mockery now mixed with something else. Suspicion. Unease. What did they see? Day whispered to Nari. The lizard's amber eyes gleamed, and for just a moment Day could have sworn she smiled. After the incident in the assembly hall, things became strange. Corvin and the other Velthari who had scanned Nari avoided Day completely. When he walked past them in the corridors, they would turn away or suddenly remember they needed to be somewhere else. Corvin, who had been so loud and mocking before, now went silent whenever Day entered a room. But the other students didn't notice this change. They only heard Corvin's public declaration that Nari was just a simple animal. The mockery increased. Someone put a sign on Day's door that read Petting Zoo. His lab materials were mysteriously damaged. Anonymous messages appeared on his personal device, all variations of the same theme. Humans didn't belong at the academy. Even Bunhana confronted him again. "You need to stop," she said, cornering him outside the cafeteria. "Whatever game you're playing with that lizard, whatever trick you used during the telepathic scan, it's making everything worse. People think you're either a fraud or an idiot. Either way, you're dragging humanity's reputation through the dirt." "I'm not playing any game," Day replied tiredly. "I'm just trying to study." "Then leave the lizard in your quarters and act like a serious student," Hana snapped. "Or better yet, send it back to Earth and admit you made a mistake bringing it here." Day looked at her for a long moment. "Why do you care so much about what they think of us?" "Because I have to live in this galaxy," Hana said. "My whole career depends on being taken seriously by other species. Every contract I sign, every project I work on, I have to prove that humans are worth the risk. And you're making that 10 times harder." She walked away before Day could respond. That night, Day sat in his quarters with Nari curled in his lap. "Maybe she's right," he told the lizard. "Maybe I'm being selfish. I wanted to prove that humans and other species could work together as equals. But all I'm proving is that we're stubborn." Nari made a low trilling sound and looked up at him with her amber eyes. "I know you want to help," Day said, "but I can't ask you to reveal yourself just to make my life easier. That's not fair to you." The lizard seemed to consider this, then closed her eyes and went to sleep. The next morning, Professor Thalen announced the semester's major field exercise. All xenobiology students would travel to a nearby moon called Talos 4 to study unusual crystal formations that supported unique bacterial life. The trip would last 3 days, with students camping in the moon's cave systems and collecting samples for analysis. "This is mandatory," Thalen emphasized. "Your performance on this exercise will determine 40% of your final grade. And yes, Mr. Kang, that means you as well, though I expect you to leave your pet behind this time." Day started to object, but saw the professor's stern expression and nodded instead. He would go on the trip, he would do the work, and he would prove his worth without Nari's help, except Nari had other ideas. The morning of the departure, Day woke to find the lizard already awake and sitting on his chest, staring at him intently. "You need to stay here," he told her. "It's only 3 days. I'll be back before you know it." Nari made a sharp chirping sound that meant disagreement. "I know you want to come," Day said, sitting up, "but it's not allowed. And honestly, it might be good for me to do this alone, to prove I can succeed without you." The lizard's amber eyes seemed to glow brighter for a moment, and Dave felt a strange sensation in his mind. Not words exactly, but a feeling, a warning. "Are you worried about me?" he asked. "I'll be fine. It's just a field exercise with professors and dozens of other students. What could go wrong?" Nari made a low hissing sound that somehow conveyed deep skepticism, but Day was determined. He said goodbye, made sure she had food and water, and joined the other students at the transport shuttle. The ride to Talos 4 took 2 hours. Day spent most of it reviewing his equipment and avoiding the hostile looks from the other students. Talos 4 was a small moon with a thin atmosphere and low gravity. The surface was covered in red rock and deep canyons. The crystal formations they had come to study were located in a vast cave system that ran deep underground. Professor Thalen split them into groups of 6 for safety. Day ended up in a group with 2 Velthari, 2 Orthani, and 1 Mecron. None of them looked happy about the arrangement. "Try not to slow us down, human," one of the Velthari muttered as they descended into the caves. The cave system was beautiful. Massive crystals grew from the walls and ceiling, glowing with soft bioluminescence. The bacterial colonies that lived on the crystals created patterns of blue and green light that shifted and changed as the students moved past. Day collected samples carefully, noting the environmental conditions for each one. Despite his groupmates ignoring him, he managed to gather excellent data. Maybe, he thought, this would finally prove his competence. They were 3 hours into the expedition when the moon decided to remind everyone that nature doesn't care about academic exercises. The first tremor was gentle, just a slight shaking that made the crystal formations chime softly. Everyone paused, looking around nervously. "That's normal for this moon," Professor Thalen announced over their communication devices. "Minor seismic activity. Nothing to worry about. Continue your work." The second tremor, 5 minutes later, was stronger. Dust fell from the ceiling and several smaller crystals cracked and fell. "All groups begin moving toward the exit," Thalen's voice said, now tense. "Orderly evacuation. No running. The third tremor hit while they were still deep in the caves. This one was massive. The ground lurched, throwing students off their feet. The sound was overwhelming, like the entire moon was screaming. Crystals exploded from the stress, sending sharp fragments everywhere. Then the ceiling came down. Day felt someone grab him and pull him sideways just as a massive section of rock crashed down where he had been standing. The world became chaos. Dust filled the air so thick he couldn't see. The sound of falling rock was deafening. People screamed. When the shaking finally stopped, Day found himself in complete darkness. His light had been damaged in the fall. He tried his communication device, but it only produced static. "Hello?" he called out. "Is anyone there?" "I'm here," a voice said nearby. It was Byun-hana. "I think my leg is broken." Slowly, other voices responded. In total, 17 students and 2 professors were trapped in a sealed section of the cave. The entrance and exit tunnels were completely blocked by fallen rock. Someone managed to get a light working. The scene was grim. They were in a chamber about 30 meters across, surrounded by collapsed tunnels. The air was thick with dust, and several students were injured. Professor Thalen was unconscious with a head wound. The other professor, a Mechron named Instructor Vex, was trying to assess the situation. "We need to contact the surface," Vex said. "But the rock is blocking our communications." One of the Velthari students tried to send a telepathic message, but the crystal-rich rock interfered with mental signals. The Mechron students attempted to use their cybernetic systems to find a way out, but their sensors couldn't penetrate the collapsed tunnels. "How much air do we have?" someone asked. Instructor Vex checked his scanner. "At current consumption rates, about 4 hours before oxygen levels become critical." Panic rippled through the group. 4 hours. The rescue teams on the surface would be trying to reach them, but they might not know exactly where to dig. The cave system was vast. "We're going to die here," a Velthari student whispered. "No," Instructor Vex said firmly. "Stay calm. Conserve your oxygen. The rescue teams know standard cave diving procedures. They'll find us." But his voice lacked conviction. 3 hours passed. The air grew stale and thin. People moved less, trying to use as little oxygen as possible. Some students cried quietly. Others sat in silence, accepting their fate. Day sat with his back against a wall, thinking about Nari alone in his quarters. Would she understand when he didn't come back? Would someone take care of her? Byun-hana sat next to him, her broken leg splinted with pieces of their equipment. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for what I said about you and your lizard. You were right. I cared too much about what they thought." "It's okay," Day replied. His voice sounded strange in the thin air. "No, it's not. You came here to learn, to grow. I came here to prove something. There's a difference." She closed her eyes. "I hope someone tells my family I wasn't a complete failure." Day looked around at the other students. These people who had mocked him, excluded him, treated him like he didn't belong. Now they were all going to die together in a collapsed cave on a forgotten moon. It seemed like a waste. He thought about Nari, about the warning she had tried to give him that morning, about the strange sensation in his mind that he had ignored. "I'm sorry," he whispered to no one. "I should have listened." And then, impossibly, he felt something. A familiar presence in his mind. Gentle but powerful, concerned but determined. Nari. "That's impossible," he said out loud. "She's 2 light hours away." "What?" Hana asked, her voice weak. "Nothing," Day said. But the presence grew stronger, and with it came a feeling, a question. "Do you trust me?" Day closed his eyes. They had less than an hour of air left. The rescue teams hadn't found them. There was no other hope. "Yes," he said out loud. "I trust you." "Who are you talking to?" Hana asked, confused. But Day didn't answer. Because something was happening. The air around him seemed to vibrate. The other students felt it too. They looked around in confusion and fear. "What is that?" someone asked. The vibration grew stronger. It felt like sound, but deeper. Like it was resonating in their bones, in their minds. Some of the students clutched their heads in pain. "Make it stop," a Velthari student cried. But Day understood. Nari was calling for help. Calling in a way that could be heard across vast distances. Calling in a way that would shatter every assumption these people had about the small lizard they had mocked. He smiled in the darkness, even as the sensation grew overwhelming. "Help is coming," he said. "How do you know?" Instructor Vex demanded. Day's smile grew wider. Because my research companion isn't what you think she is. None of you ever bothered to really look. The vibration reached a peak and then, impossibly, they heard it. Not with their ears, but with their minds. A sound that shouldn't exist. A roar that echoed across space itself. The sound in their minds grew louder, more intense. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was overwhelming, like trying to look directly at the sun. Every person in the collapsed cave felt it pressing against their consciousness, demanding attention. "What is happening?" Instructor Vex shouted, his cybernetic systems flickering wildly. "My neural implants are registering something impossible. There's a telepathic signal, but it's not coming from inside the cave. It's coming from orbit." "That can't be right," one of the Velthari students said, her crystalline face flickering with confusion. "Telepathic signals can't travel through space. The distance is too great. Someone tell it to stop," another student cried, clutching his head. But Day just sat there calmly, a small smile on his face. "She heard me. She's coming." "Who?" Byunhana asked, looking at him with wide eyes. "Who's coming?" Before Day could answer, the vibration in the air changed. It was no longer a call. It was a response, and it was much, much closer. On the station in Day's small quarters, something was happening. Nari, the small emerald lizard that everyone had dismissed as a pet, stood in the center of the room. Her amber eyes glowed like small suns. The air around her shimmered and bent. Then she began to change. It started slowly. Her scales, which had always seemed bright, now began to shine with an inner light. Each scale reflected colors that shouldn't exist, shades that had no name in any language. Her body, so small and harmless, began to expand. She grew from the size of a house cat to the size of a dog. Then larger. Her neck lengthened, becoming serpentine and powerful. Her legs thickened, muscles rippling under scales that had become as hard as diamond. Horns emerged from her skull, curving backward in elegant arcs. Her tail grew long and barbed, strong enough to shatter steel. Within minutes, she had grown too large for the small quarters. The furniture was pushed aside like toys. The walls creaked under the pressure of her expanding form. But she didn't stop. When the transformation finished, a creature of terrible beauty stood where a small lizard had been. She was the size of a terrestrial bear, covered in crystalline scales that reflected impossible light. Her amber eyes, now large as dinner plates, held an intelligence that was ancient and vast. She was a Drethian worm, a species the galaxy had declared extinct 3,000 years ago. Nari looked at the wall that separated her from space, from the moon where Day was dying. She opened her massive jaws and released the sound. It was not a roar that traveled through air. It was a roar of pure consciousness, a psychic scream that pierced through space and matter like they were nothing. It carried across the void, through the station's hull, through the vacuum of space, through the moon's rocky surface, through the collapsed cave tunnels. It was a roar that announced her existence to every telepathic mind in the system. In the collapsed cave, the effect was immediate and devastating. The 3 Velthari students, with their sensitive telepathic abilities, were hit first. They collapsed instantly, their minds unable to process the sheer power and complexity of what they were experiencing. It was like trying to hold an ocean in a teacup. One of them, a young student named Riala, looked up at Day with tears streaming down her crystalline face. "What is it?" she whispered. "What kind of mind is that?" The Orthani students fared only slightly better. Their ancient minds recognized something in the roar, some echo from their species' long history. Professor Thalin, who had regained consciousness, stared at nothing with wide eyes, his mouth moving silently as if trying to remember words from millennia ago. Even the Mekron students, with their cybernetic enhancements and technological defenses, found their systems overwhelmed. Instructor Vex's implants sparked and shut down one by one, unable to handle the sheer volume of data in the psychic signal. "Impossible," Vex muttered. The processing power required to generate a signal like this. It would take a planetary-scale computer network. Nothing biological could, but something biological was doing exactly that. Byunhana, who had minimal psychic sensitivity, still felt the roar like a physical pressure in her skull. She looked at Day, who sat calmly through it all and finally understood. "The lizard," she whispered. "That's your lizard, Nari," Day corrected gently. "Her name is Nari, and she's not a lizard. She's a Drethian worm. The name meant nothing to Hana, but it clearly meant something to the Orthani. Professor Thalen turned his massive head toward Day. His ancient eyes filled with something that might have been terror. The galaxy burned them all, Thalen said hoarsely. The war lasted 10,000 years. We made sure none survived. We had to. They were too powerful, too dangerous. They could shatter minds with a thought. You hunted them for their neural crystalline matrices, Day said, his voice hard. You harvested their brains to power your telepathic networks. You committed genocide for profit. We did what was necessary, Thalen replied, but his voice was weak. They were a threat to all civilized species. They were living beings who wanted to be left alone, Day said. And when your ancestors wouldn't leave them alone, they fought back. You call it a war. They call it survival. The roar intensified. Outside the cave, on the moon's surface, the rescue team suddenly found themselves looking at their scanners in disbelief. Where before they had seen only solid rock and interference, now there was a beacon, a psychic signal so powerful it cut through the moon's dense mineral layers like they were transparent. I've got them, a rescue team leader shouted. Section 7, depth 200 meters. The signal is... By the stars, I've never seen anything like this. What's generating that much psychic energy? The rescue teams mobilized immediately, drilling toward the trapped students with renewed urgency. In the cave, Nari's roar began to fade, but its purpose was complete. The rescue teams knew exactly where to dig. Help would arrive within 20 minutes. The students sat in stunned silence. The Velthari students were still recovering, their minds reeling from contact with something so far beyond their understanding. Corvin, who had scanned Nari weeks ago, now understood why he had lied about what he saw. His mind had tried to protect itself by rejecting the truth. I saw her true mind during the scan, he said quietly. For just a moment before she showed me only what I could handle. It was like standing at the edge of infinity. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? And if they did believe me, they would hunt her, Day finished. Just like they hunted all the others. How did humanity find a Drethian? Thalen asked. The professor's voice held a mix of fear and desperate curiosity. How did you earn the trust of a species that has every reason to hate all of us? We didn't know what she was, Day said simply. 3 years ago, I was hiking in the mountains of Korea. I found a small injured lizard caught in a trap set by poachers. I freed her, treated her wounds, and gave her food and water. When she healed, she chose to stay with me. You had no idea what you were helping? Vex asked, incredulous. No, I just saw a creature that needed help. We became friends, partners. When I decided to apply to the academy, she wanted to come with me. We both knew it would be difficult, but we thought we could prove that humans and other species could work together as equals. Instead, we mocked you, Riella said softly. We called her a pet. We treated you both like you were less than us. Yes, Day said. You did. Byun-Hana looked at Dai with new eyes. You let us mock you, exclude you, make your life miserable. You could have proven yourself at any time by revealing what Nari was. But you didn't. Because it wasn't my secret to reveal, Day said. Nari chose to hide. She chose to appear as a simple lizard because it was safer. After what the galaxy did to her species, can you blame her? But she revealed herself to save us, Hana said. Even though we treated you both terribly. Why? Day smiled sadly. Because that's what good people do. They help others even when those others don't deserve it. The sound of drilling echoed through the cave. The rescue teams were close. The students began to stir, preparing to be evacuated. But something had changed in that cave. The arrogance had been shattered. The certainty had been broken. Professor Thalen pulled himself up, leaning heavily against the cave wall. Kang Day, he said formally. I owe you and your companion an apology. I made assumptions based on prejudice and pride. I was wrong. Yes, Day said simply. You were. The professor nodded slowly. When we return to the academy, things will be different. I will personally ensure that your research is given proper respect. And your companion. If she's willing, the galaxy needs to know that the Drethians survived. We need to make amends for what we did. That's not my decision to make, Day said. Nari will decide for herself what she wants the galaxy to know. The drilling broke through, flooding the cave with fresh air and light. The rescue teams poured in, helping the injured students and professors toward the surface. As they emerged onto the moon's surface and boarded the rescue shuttles, every student was quiet. They had entered those caves thinking they understood their place in the galaxy. They had believed in their species' superiority, in their own importance. They left those caves knowing they understood nothing at all, and somewhere on the station above, a magnificent creature was carefully shrinking back into the form of a small emerald lizard, waiting patiently for her friend to come home. When Day returned to his quarters, he found Nari in her small form, curled up on his desk. She looked exhausted. The transformation and the psychic roar had drained her considerably. When she saw him, her amber eyes brightened and she made a soft chirping sound. Day carefully picked her up and held her close. "Thank you," he whispered. "You saved all of us, even the ones who were cruel to you." Nari nuzzled against his chest, a gesture that meant she understood. And more than that, she would do it again if needed. But the academy was not a place that could simply ignore what had happened. Within hours of the rescue, emergency meetings were called. The station's administration gathered professors, department heads, and senior researchers. Everyone wanted answers. How had a signal pierced through space and solid rock? What kind of creature had Kang Day brought to the academy? And most importantly, was the station in danger? Professor Thalen stood before the council chamber, his ancient face grave. "I have examined the historical archives," he said. "What we witnessed was a Drathian worm, a species we declared extinct after the Harvest Wars ended 3 millennia ago." The chamber erupted in shocked voices. A Velthari counselor stood. "That's impossible. The Drathians were all eliminated. Their neural matrices were too valuable and they were too dangerous to leave alive. The combined forces of 12 species hunted them for 10,000 years. Apparently some survived," Thalen said, "and they did so by hiding, by appearing as simple animals on primitive worlds where no one would think to look. Earth," another counselor said, "the human homeworld. How many more are hiding there?" "I don't know," Thalen admitted, "but I suspect we're about to find out." Ambassador Li Taeyang arrived from Earth 3 days later. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair and calm eyes. He listened to the Academy's concerns, reviewed the evidence, and then asked to meet with Kang Day privately. They sat in a small conference room, Nari in her small form perched on Dai's shoulder as always. "The Earth government had no idea," Taeyang said carefully. "We've been searching our records, our surveillance data, our ecological surveys. If there are more Drathians on Earth, they've hidden themselves perfectly. Maybe they just want to be left alone," Day suggested. "Perhaps, but now that the galaxy knows they exist, can they remain hidden?" Taeyang looked at Nari. "May I ask her a question?" Day glanced at Nari, who chirped softly. "She says yes. Are there others like you on Earth?" Nari's eyes glowed briefly and Day felt a familiar sensation in his mind. Images, feelings, understanding. "She says yes." Day translated. "Not many. A few dozen scattered across the world. They've been hiding as various reptiles and amphibians, living quiet lives, healing from the trauma of the genocide. Will they reveal themselves now that your friend has?" Nari made a complex series of sounds and Day listened carefully to the feelings in his mind. "She says that's for each of them to decide. She chose to reveal herself to save lives. Others may choose differently. But she wants the galaxy to know this. The Drathians are not a threat. They never were. They only wanted to exist in peace. When they were hunted, they fought back. When they were pushed to extinction, they hid. They adapted. They survived." Taeyang nodded slowly. "The Earth government is prepared to offer asylum to any Drathian who wishes to remain hidden. We will not allow the Harvest Wars to repeat themselves." "Thank you," Day said. "But I think Nari has a different plan." Over the following weeks, the Academy transformed. At first, there was fear. Students and faculty who had grown up believing Drathians were extinct monsters now had to reconcile that belief with the reality of a small, gentle creature who had saved their lives. But slowly, curiosity replaced fear. Xenobiology students began to ask questions. What were the Drathians' true capabilities? How did their telepathy work? What was their society like before the genocide? Professor Thalen approached Day with a formal request. Would Nari be willing to participate in voluntary research? Not as a specimen, but as a colleague. We could learn so much, and it might help heal the wounds between our species. Day consulted with Nari, who agreed on certain conditions. The research would be conducted respectfully. She would not be treated as a test subject, but as a partner, and any discoveries would be shared with other Drethians who might eventually reveal themselves. The first research session was attended by nearly 100 students and professors. Day stood at the center of a lecture hall with Nari on his shoulder. "Before we begin," Day said, "I want to make something clear. Nari is not here to be studied like a specimen under a microscope. She's here to teach you. There's a difference." He gently set Nari on a raised platform. Then, with her permission, she began to transform. The audience watched in silent awe as the small lizard expanded into her true form. The magnificent draconic creature filled the front of the lecture hall, her crystalline scales catching the light in impossible ways. But unlike before, there was no roar, no overwhelming psychic pressure. Just her presence, powerful and ancient and beautiful. A young Velthari student raised her hand. It was Riala, one of the students who had been in the collapsed cave. "May I ask a question?" Nari's large head turned toward her and nodded. "During the rescue, when your mind touched ours, I saw something. It wasn't just consciousness. It was like music. Mathematical patterns that felt like emotions, colors that tasted like thoughts."
"How is that possible?"
Day listened as Nari's thoughts flowed through his mind, then translated. "She says that Drethian telepathy doesn't work like Velthari telepathy. You read surface thoughts and emotions. Drethians perceive the fundamental patterns of consciousness itself, the mathematical structures that underlie all thought. It's why your telepathic scan couldn't accurately read her. You were looking at the words on a page while she exists as the meaning behind language itself." The lecture hall was silent as students and professors absorbed this information. It was Instructor Vex who spoke next. "Your roar traveled through space," he said, "through solid rock, through interference that should have made telepathic contact impossible. The amount of energy required should have killed you." "How again?" Day translated. "She says that consciousness isn't limited by physical distance or physical barriers. It exists in a dimension you don't fully understand yet. The roar wasn't traveling through space. It was resonating across the pattern of consciousness itself. Distance is irrelevant to something that exists in all places simultaneously." Byun-hana stood. Unlike before, when she had been hostile and embarrassed, now she looked at Nari with respect. "I spent weeks being angry at Day for bringing you here. I thought you made humanity look weak and primitive. I was wrong. You're not a reflection of human weakness. You're an example of human compassion. Day helped you when you were injured, even though he had no idea what you were. That's not weakness. That's strength." Nari made a soft sound that somehow conveyed gratitude. Over the next few months, word spread throughout the galaxy. The Drethians had survived. They had been hiding on Earth and possibly other worlds. The species that had been hunted to extinction had adapted, had endured, had found allies in the youngest spacefaring civilization. The reactions were mixed. Some species, particularly the Orthani and Velthari, whose ancestors had led the Harvest Wars, expressed shame and a desire to make amends. Others were fearful, remembering the old stories of Drethians who could shatter minds with a thought. But slowly more Drethians began to reveal themselves. A small gecko in Australia transformed into a juvenile worm. A salamander in Brazil revealed its true nature. Each one had been living quietly on Earth, hiding among humanity's rich biodiversity. And each one had a story of some human who had helped them, fed them, protected them, shown them kindness without expecting anything in return. The Earth government established the Drethian Protection Initiative, guaranteeing that no Drethian would be forced to reveal themselves or participate in research against their will. Earth became known as a sanctuary world, a place where ancient beings could heal from millennia of trauma. At the Academy, Day's status transformed completely. He was no longer the mocked outsider with a pet lizard. He was now the human who had befriended a Drethian worm, who had endured mockery and exclusion without revealing his companion's true nature, who had respected her choice to remain hidden, even when it cost him socially. Professor Thalen personally apologized today in front of the entire xenobiology department. "I judged you based on my prejudices," the ancient Orthani said. "I saw a young human from a species I considered inferior, and I treated you accordingly. I was wrong. You taught me humility. You taught us all humility." Corvin, the Velthari student who had attempted to scan Nari, also approached Day with an apology. "When I touched her mind during the scan, I saw something that terrified me. Something so vast and complex I couldn't comprehend it. My instinct was to hide what I'd seen, To pretend I'd found nothing important. I was a coward. You were protecting yourself, Day said. That's understandable. Perhaps. But I should have protected her instead. If I had told the truth about what I sensed, maybe the mockery would have stopped. Maybe you both would have been treated with respect sooner. Or maybe you would have put her in danger, Day replied. Fear makes people do terrible things. You saw what your ancestors did to her species. Corvin nodded sadly. We have much to atone for. 6 months after the cave incident, the Academy held a special ceremony. Nari, in her true form, was awarded an honorary position as a guest lecturer in xenobiology. She would teach about Drethian culture, history, and their unique understanding of consciousness. But more importantly, she would teach about survival, about adaptation, about the strength required to hide who you truly are in order to survive, and about the courage required to reveal yourself when it matters most. Day stood beside her as Ambassador Taeyang presented the honor. The lecture hall was filled with students and professors from every species at the Academy. There was no mockery now, only respect. Nari represents something the galaxy forgot, Taeyang said. The power of compassion over conquest, the strength of patience over pride. 3,000 years ago, the galaxy tried to eliminate the Drathians through violence. Today, humanity offered them friendship. One approach led to genocide and guilt. The other led to healing and understanding. He turned to address the entire assembly. Humanity is young. We don't have the Velthari's telepathic abilities or the Orthani's ancient wisdom or the Mecron's technological advancement. But we have something equally valuable. We have the ability to see an injured creature and help it without asking what we'll gain. We have the capacity to befriend those who are different without demanding they prove their worth. Perhaps that's humanity's gift to the galaxy. Not strength or intelligence, but simple kindness. The assembly rose in respectful applause, not the polite, obligatory applause of formal ceremonies, but genuine appreciation. Later that evening, Day sat in his quarters with Nari and her small form curled in his lap. They looked out the window at the stars. Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this? Day asked her. Nari chirped softly, and Day felt her thoughts in his mind. Yes and no. She had hoped humanity would be different from the other species, that they would prove worthy of trust. But she had also feared revealing herself would lead to danger. Are you glad you came here? Day asked. The feeling in his mind was clear. Yes. Because their journey together had proven something important, that the galaxy could change, that old wounds could heal, that species who had been enemies could become friends. What happens now? Day wondered. The semester's ending soon. We could go back to Earth, live quietly like before. But Nari's response was firm. No. There was work to do. Other Drethians needed to see that it was safe to emerge. The galaxy needed to learn that power doesn't require domination, that the strongest beings can choose gentleness. Day smiled and stroked her scales gently. Then we stay, we teach, we build bridges. Nari's amber eyes gleamed with approval. Outside the window, the stars shone bright. And on countless worlds throughout the galaxy, small creatures that were more than they appeared looked up at those same stars and began to hope. The Drethians had survived extinction. They had endured genocide. They had hidden for 3,000 years. But now, slowly, carefully, they were ready to return, not as conquerors, not as threats, but as teachers, as partners, as friends. And it was a small human from Earth, with his simple act of compassion toward an injured lizard in the mountains, who had made it all possible. Because sometimes the greatest strength is not the power to destroy, but the courage to care, and sometimes the smallest gesture of kindness can change the entire galaxy.